In this project, we're going to run and build our Docker application from within a Docker container. So first, we're going to need to write a Dockerfile to containerize our Django application. Now, the Dockerfile allows us to build a custom Django image, which is necessary because we're using Alpine Linux as the base image. Now, since Alpine is minimal, we need to manually install PostgreSQL dependencies. This is going to ensure Django can connect to the PostgreSQL database. Once we've created the Dockerfile, we can then integrate the new service in our Docker Compose file. Let's start by creating a Dockerfile. All right, so let's start with defining the image. So here we're going to use a Python image. This will provide the Python interpreter and the Alpine Linux 3.21 operating system. So this is a lightweight environment with Python pre-installed. So then we go ahead and set the app folder as the working directory inside the container. So that's where we're going to create our Django application from within the container. Now we need to install our system level packages using Alpine's package manager. So here I've created a new requirements text file and defined all of the packages that we're going to be using in this project. Django and Django REST framework for our API. We're going to use DRF Spectacular for our API documentation, Redis because we want to connect to our Redis database, and we're going to need a driver. So a database driver. So this allows us to communicate from our Django app to our Postgres database. So back in the Dockerfile, we copy across the requirements text over to our app directory in our image, and then we go ahead and pip install. So here we've used the command no cache dir flag, which prevents pip from caching package files, keeping the image size small. So now we need to define our Docker service in our Docker Compose file. So under the previous services, we add a new service Django, and then we define build. So build here tells Docker Compose to build the Docker image for this service using the Dockerfile in the current directory. So that's the dot here. So when we run Docker Compose up, Docker will look for the current directory for the Dockerfile, build an image from it, and then start a container based upon that image. So next up, we define the container name and then define restart always as we've done previously. And then this time depends on, because ideally we want to try and bring up the databases before we start the application. Now, this doesn't mean that Django is going to wait for the services to fully come up. It just means that we're going to try and start Postgres and Redis first. Right, so then we define the ports. So our Django container, we're going to open up port 8000 to communicate with Django. That's the default port for our Django server. Now, in order to start our Docker service, we're going to define a command, which is going to start Django server. So here in the command, we've specified a shell command, Python manage.py run server, and then to start the server on 008000. Now, this can be often confusing. Why use 00008000 and not, for example, localhost or 127.0.0.1, the loopback address? Simply put, if you were to use localhost or 127.0.0.1, Django will only be accessible from within the container itself. But by using 0000, the container exposes the server to the external connections, including your host machine or browser. So we use it so that we can access the service from outside the container. Right, so I've gone ahead and removed all the containers, and I'm keeping the images in place because there's no need for us to download those again. And let's now go through the process of setting up our containers once again, but this time, of course, with our Django service. So let's run Docker Compose up with the build. Now, when you go over to the containers, everything should be green except the Django app. You can see we have the spinner here, and that is because we don't actually have a Django application to start. So we're trying to start the server, but of course, we don't have an application. So we'll solve that problem in the next tutorial. Right, so that's everything we need to get started at this stage. Now, something I did change was the container name for the Postgres service. I've just renamed that to Postgres, and that just makes it consistent with the other naming for the other containers.